when you get to the second half of the archaeology, the part after 12, after the Trojan War, I think you might be disappointed in a little bit because it's not so speculative and not as interesting and innovative as the first part, and it's more factual. And although it does give us information we want, so he has more information here because he's dealing with the period in the so-called Dark Ages and the centuries immediately preceding his own. It has no more deductions. All of that deductive terminology now disappears, like it obviously, or it's plausible, or it seems to me. He's not deducing anything from clues anymore in the second part. And he also can date events. And so he's just passing on dates of events. And it's got no digressions on method. And he also has to make some exceptions. He makes these generalizations, but then since he knows more, in particular, he has to make exceptions for the Greeks in Sicily. So almost everything that he says in the second half is not quite true. For example, he says tyrants prevented growth, and that's not true of Sicily. And he also says tyrants were overthrown by the Spartans, and that's not true of Sicily. But he does give a lot of valuable information, and it's pretty negative, like the first one. He wants to say that first of all, after the Trojan War, there was great instability in Greece because the aftermath of the Trojan War caused a lot of political upheaval, and so there was no solid government, and that was succeeded by tyrants. And he doesn't have a good opinion of tyrants here. In Book 6, when he's talking about the Pisistratids, he has a pretty good opinion of them, but in this case, he goes along with the standard view of tyrants, which is once you become a tyrant, you only care about yourself and your own personal safety, and you can't actually do anything for your city because you've seized power unlawfully, and you have nothing to rally people behind you except fear. So those are the two things. But he does try in this section to give some previews of things that will be important in the Peloponnesian War. So we're now getting to sea power. We're getting to some triremes, and we're getting to Corinth becoming a sea power, both mercantile and in security, and putting down piracy. And we're also getting to the rise of Athens and Sparta at the end of it. And so it actually turns into less of a archaeology, in other words, why nothing big happened before this war, into how at the end of this period something big developed, namely in the post-Persian War, Athenians and Spartan alliances and how much power they put together. And so he does give a couple of paragraphs prepping you for the power of each state and how they differed from each other in their culture and in their government and in their military power. So that's a little bit of a departure from the archaeology. And later on in book 1, he's actually going to come back to that in a section called the 50-year period, which is almost certainly a later edition, by the way. I just wanted to stress that. I'm a pretty much a Unitarian when it comes to Thucydides. I don't think that he has early and late parts everywhere, but he actually says in chapter 97, I've changed my plan here and I've added something. What he's added is he's replaced this brief section at the end of the archaeology about how Sparta and Athens got their alliances, which is just a paragraph or two. And he's replaced that with about 10 pages of summary of what they did, of how they fought against each other in the war. And then at the very end of this section, the end of a ring composition is often 2 parts. That always bothered me, and then I read in a book by Mary Douglas that seems to be true of many ring compositions, that at the end they're complicated. There's not just one big ring. And so the last ring has 2 parts of 2 rings at the end, and in between them, and the end, just like the beginning says, and that is And that is what I thought was most likely to be true about the ancient stories, even though it's difficult to believe in all the evidence precisely, and you have to do some speculation. So he says that again twice, but in between he says, and by the way, a lot of people have wrong opinions even about their own cities when it comes to this early evidence and or oral tradition in general. And then he cites two instances, actually three instances. And the first one is the Athenians believe that the tyrannicides actually killed the tyrant. They're called the tyrannicides. Of course, they killed the tyrant. Well, no, they made a mistake. The tyrannicides in the 6th century blew it. They killed the wrong guy. And the tyranny continued. And in book 6, he's going to come back and go on about this at greater length. But in this case, he just gives you the account of the murder. He said that the murder actually occurred. They said, oh, we're found out. Let's kill somebody at least. Let's kill somebody. So they randomly killed a person who wasn't tyrant. And he doesn't go on about that. But in book 6, he's going to go on for maybe 5-6 pages about this. And then he says, and there are two little things that people are wrong about. And one is that there is that the Spartan kings have 2 votes instead of just 1, and they don't. And the second thing is that there is in Sparta a military division of the army called the Pitana Company, and that doesn't even exist. And so these are really an odd assortment of things, but if you look at Herodotus, you'll find they're both in Herodotus. The 2 votes is something he says, and they're also both about Sparta. The 2 votes is something Herodotus says, and the Pitana Company, he doesn't say it out. He doesn't say it in so many words, but the Pitana Company plays a key role in his account of the Battle of Plataea. It's a bit part in the battle that becomes extremely important at a crucial time. And so Herodotus and Thucydides is saying, well, Herodotus told a story, but this bit part that he made so important, that doesn't actually even exist. So, but characteristically, he doesn't quote Herodotus. He just criticizes him. But that doesn't mean that he doesn't follow Herodotus in many, many other places and expand on what he says. So that I've tried to indicate in my commentary on book 1. There's just many, many places where if you compare what he says with Herodotus, it corresponds quite nicely, or he expands on something Herodotus says.